He didn't flinch when they put her on the wagon. Wyatt Boone stood at the edge of that crowd with his jaw locked and his hand resting on his saddlebag, watching a town full of men laugh at a woman who hadn't eaten in 3 days. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved in other people's business. He had one rule, and he'd kept it for 15 years. But when the auctioneer raised his hand and called out $30, something in Wyatt's chest cracked open like dry timber. He stepped forward. If this story already has your heart, hit subscribe and come along for the ride and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Summer came hard to Black Hollow that year. The kind of summer that dried up creek beds and cracked the earth open like old leather. The kind that made men mean and desperate and willing to do things they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. The mountain passes above town still held a breath of cool pine air, but down in the valley where the saloons and the assay offices and the sheriff's office all leaned against each other like drunks at closing time, the heat was a living thing. It pressed down on your shoulders. It got into your lungs. Wyatt Boone hadn't planned on coming to Black Hollow at all. He needed supplies. Salt flour, a new length of rope, and the trading post at Copper Ridge had been cleaned out for 2 weeks running. That was the only reason he'd come down off his mountain. That was the only reason he was standing at the far edge of that crowd when the wagon rolled into the center of town. He noticed the silence first, not a true silence. There was plenty of noise. Men talking, boots scraping on packed dirt. The low, ugly sound of laughter from somewhere near the saloon steps. But the kind of silence he meant was the silence underneath all of that. The silence that meant nobody was going to say a word about what was happening. Nobody was going to step forward. Nobody was going to do a single thing. The wagon stopped. There were 3 women on it. 2 of them were crying. The third one wasn't. She stood at the far end of the wagon bed with her arms at her sides and her chin lifted at an angle that looked like pride until you got close enough to see her eyes. Her dress was gray with road dust and torn at one shoulder. There was a bruise along her left jaw, faded to yellow at the edges, which meant it was a few days old, which meant somebody had hit her before she'd even gotten to Black Hollow. Her feet were bare. The planks beneath her had to be burning hot. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at something just above their heads, like she was watching a horizon that nobody else could see. Wyatt told himself he wasn't going to look twice. The auctioneer was a fat man in a striped vest who kept mopping his forehead with a handkerchief that had long since stopped doing any good. He had the voice of a man who'd been doing this long enough that he'd stopped thinking about what it was. "Lot 3, the fat man called out. "Abigail Carter, age 26, strong back, no known ailments, good with domestic work. Debt certified by the office of Mr. Randall Crow." Randall Crow. Wyatt felt something go still inside him at that name, like a compass needle finding north. Opening bid $20. There was a ripple through the crowd. A few men laughed. One of them called out a number. Another topped it. The woman on the wagon, Abigail Carter, didn't move, didn't flinch. Her hands were clasped in front of her and her knuckles had gone white, but her face didn't give anything away. Not one thing. $30. The man who'd called it was leaning against the side of the general store with his thumbs hooked in his belt. He was grinning the way men grin when they think they've already won something. $30, the auctioneer called. "Do I hear 35? Wyatt's jaw tightened. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved. He had a mountain. He had a cabin. He had 40 head of cattle and a horse he trusted more than any person he'd ever known. He had 15 years of keeping his head down and his business his own, and he had very good reasons for all of it. He did not step into other people's messes. He did not make promises he didn't intend to keep. He did not stand in the middle of a street in a town full of cowards and pretend he could fix what was broken. He started to turn away, and then Abigail Carter's eyes dropped from that invisible horizon, and for just a fraction of a second, they landed on him. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She didn't do anything a woman in her position might have done to try to move a stranger to action. She just looked at him, flat and clear and without any illusion whatsoever about what her options were or what kind of men surrounded her. It was the look of someone who had already been disappointed by the entire world and had simply decided to keep breathing anyway. Wyatt had seen that look before. He'd seen it in the mirror a long time ago. $40. He said it before he'd made a decision to say it. His voice came out even and low, carrying across the crowd, the way voices do when they're not trying to be heard, but are heard anyway, because something in the tone of them demands it. The crowd went quiet. Every head turned. Wyatt stood where he was. He didn't move toward the wagon. He didn't take off his hat. He just looked at the auctioneer with an expression that said he'd said his number once and had no intention of saying it again. The auctioneer blinked. $40. Do I hear 45? Nobody said a word. The man by the general store had stopped grinning. He was looking at Wyatt now the way men look at something when they're trying to decide whether it's worth the trouble and then deciding slowly that it probably isn't. Sold, the auctioneer said. For $40. To... He paused, squinting. To the gentleman in the back. There was a murmur through the crowd. Not a friendly one. Wyatt walked forward, counted out the bills from the inside pocket of his vest, and laid them on the auctioneer's table without a word. The auctioneer took them like he was handling something that might bite. A deputy stepped off the saloon porch, young, trying to look like he wasn't nervous. You got business in Black Hollow, Cowboy. Had, Wyatt said. Getting supplies. That all. That's all. The deputy looked at Abigail, then back at Wyatt. He chewed the inside of his cheek. Mr. Crow runs a clean operation. Debt's legal. You understand that. I understand what legal means, Wyatt said. Do you? The deputy didn't have an answer for that. He stepped back. Wyatt turned to the wagon. Abigail had climbed down on her own. She was standing in the dirt with her bare feet and her torn dress, and she was looking at him with those flat, clear eyes, and she wasn't saying thank you, and she wasn't crying, and she wasn't acting like he'd saved her because she was too smart to assume yet that he had. He respected that. You got shoes? He asked. No, she said. Boots in my saddlebag. They'll be too big. I'll manage. You got anything in town? Belongings. They took everything when they brought me in. He nodded. He'd expected that. He walked to his horse, a big dark roan named Scout, who endured strangers with a level of patience Wyatt had always privately envied, and dug the spare boots out of the left saddlebag. He held them out. Abigail took them. She sat down right there in the dirt in the middle of the street with people still watching from the saloon porch, and she put the boots on without looking at anyone or asking for anything. Where are you taking me? She asked without looking up. My place, Wyatt said. Up the mountain. She looked up then. Why? It was a fair question. A smart question. He appreciated that she asked it instead of just going along. Because you've got nowhere else to go, he said. And because I'm not leaving you here. You don't know me. No, he agreed. You don't know anything about me. No, he agreed again. She studied him for a long moment. Her jaw was set. There was something working behind her eyes, calculation maybe, or the specific kind of wariness that comes from having trusted people and had it go wrong every single time. Are you going to try to own me? She asked. The way he did? The question landed hard. He looked at her straight. I don't own people, he said. You'll have your own room. You'll work if you want to work. You can leave when you've got somewhere to leave to. I'm not Crow. Her chin lifted again. People say things like that. I know they do, Wyatt said. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to get on the horse. Another long moment. Then Abigail Carter stood up, pulled the two big boots straight, and walked to Scout's side. I want it on record, she said quietly, that I don't trust you. Noted, Wyatt said. And if you try anything, I won't. You don't know what I was going to say. Doesn't matter, he said. I won't. She looked at him one more time. Then she put her foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle with a practiced ease that told him she'd ridden before, probably more than most women in town would have. He took the reins and walked Scout forward, out of the center of town, past the watching faces, and the saloon porch, and the deputy, who'd decided to find something else to look at. Nobody stopped them. They rode in silence for the first hour. The town fell away behind them. The road turned to a trail, and the trail turned to something more like a suggestion. The trees grew taller and closer together. The air changed cooler, carrying the smell of pine resin, and something green and alive that the town didn't have. Abigail didn't speak. Neither did Wyatt. That was all right. He wasn't a man who talked to fill space. But after a while, as the trail began to climb in earnest, and Scout's breath grew heavier with the grade, she spoke. "How far is it?" 3 hours. Little more if we take it slow. "We should take it slow," she said. "Your horse is tired." He glanced back at her. She was watching Scout's ears, which were flat with effort. She'd noticed before he had. "He'll be fine," Wyatt said. "But you're right. We'll walk the steep section." She nodded, said nothing more. Another mile. The trail bent east, following a creek that ran fast and cold with snowmelt from the peaks above. The shadows were long now, late afternoon bleeding toward evening. Somewhere above them, a hawk called once and went quiet. "How long have you been up here?" Abigail asked. 15 years, give or take." "Alone?" "Yes." She seemed to think about that. "By choice?" "Yes." "Why?" He considered not answering. Then he said, "It's quieter." She made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been something else. He couldn't tell. They came around a bend in the trail, and she saw the valley below them. Black Hollow reduced now to a smear of brown against the flatlands, small and far away. And she looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Something moved across her face. Something that wasn't quite grief, and wasn't quite relief, and was probably both of them at the same time, pressed together like pages in a wet book. "My father is buried there," she said finally, "in Black Hollow." Wyatt said nothing. Waited. "He died 6 weeks ago," she said. "I had been taking care of him for 2 years. He was sick for a long time." She paused. "When he died, I found out he owed money to Randall Crowe. I didn't know. He never told me how much. They came the day of the funeral." "I'm sorry," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "Are you?" "Yes." She seemed to decide he meant it. "They took the house first. Then they said the debt wasn't settled, that I had to work it off." She stopped. "You know what Crowe's mines are like." "Yes," he said. And he did know. He'd heard things over the years. Men who went into those mines didn't always come back out. And women who went in disappeared in a different way. "I wouldn't have lasted a month," Abigail said, not with self-pity, just as a fact. "Probably not," Wyatt said. She looked at him sharply, like she'd expected him to soften it. "You wanted the truth," he said. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I did." The trail steepened. They both dismounted without discussion and walked Scout up through a series of switchbacks, the rocks loose underfoot, the air noticeably thinner. She walked steadily, the oversized boots somehow not slowing her down. She was in better shape than she looked, he thought, or more determined, or both. At the top of the switchbacks, the land opened up. Meadow grass gold at the tips, the smell of wildflowers. And there, set back against the tree line with a low porch and a stone chimney, was the cabin. Abigail stopped. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. "It's real," she said. He didn't know quite what she meant by that, but he thought he understood it. "It's real," he said. "Come on." Inside, he lit the lantern. The cabin was plain and clean. A table, 2 chairs, a stove, shelves of provisions along the east wall, and 2 doors leading to the sleeping rooms. He opened the second door and set the lantern on the small table inside. "This is your room," he said. "Locks on the inside. I won't come in without knocking, and I won't knock unless there's a reason." She stood in the doorway and looked in. A bed with a wool blanket, a window facing east. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again. He'd been waiting for the question to come back around. It always did with people who were smart enough to keep asking it. "I have my reasons," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "But it's what I've got tonight." She turned to look at him. The lantern light was warm between them, and for just a moment, the wariness in her face softened enough to show what was underneath it. Not trust, not yet, but something like curiosity, something like the beginning of a question she hadn't figured out how to ask. "Good night, Mr. Boone," she said. "Good night, Miss Carter." She closed the door. He stood in the main room for a moment, listening to the mountains settle around the cabin, the creak of timber, the wind in the pines, the distant sound of water, and then he blew out the lamp and went to bed. He lay awake for a long time. He hadn't told her why he was really here. He hadn't told her what he knew about Randall Crowe, or what he'd been quietly doing about it for going on 6 years now. He hadn't told her about the names in the ledger he kept under the loose floorboard beneath his bunk. The names of men and women who'd disappeared into Crowe's orbit and never come back. He hadn't told her any of that. But when she'd said her father had been Crowe's debtor, something had clicked into place like a key in a lock. Something that told him her being here wasn't accident, that whatever came next was going to require more of him than a spare room and a wool blanket. He stared at the ceiling. Outside, the summer wind moved through the pines, and Wyatt Boone, who had spent 15 years making sure he had no one left to lose, understood with a cold and certain clarity that he had just made things considerably more complicated for himself. He just didn't know yet how much more. She was up before him. That was the first surprise. Wyatt had lived alone long enough that the sounds of his cabin had become an extension of his own breathing. He knew every creak, every settle, every particular groan of the stovepipe when the wind shifted. So when he heard the fire catch at 4:45 in the morning, before the birds had fully decided whether it was worth waking up, he was on his feet with his hand on the doorframe before he'd fully processed what he was hearing. He opened his door. Abigail was at the stove. She'd found the coffee tin without being told where it was. She'd found the pan. She was frying salt pork with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this particular task 10,000 times and expected no praise for it. She didn't look up. "I didn't go through your things," she said. "Everything I used was on the open shelf." "I wasn't worried about that," he said. "You were standing in the doorway like you were ready to be robbed. I was surprised," he said. "There's a difference." She glanced at him then, a quick measuring look. "Do you want coffee?" "Yes." "Then sit down and stop filling up the doorway." He sat down. He couldn't remember the last time someone had told him to sit down in his own kitchen. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. He poured the coffee she'd already set out and drank it and watched her work, and the thing that struck him, the thing he couldn't quite put aside, was how efficient she was. No wasted motion, no uncertainty. She moved through an unfamiliar kitchen like she'd mapped it in her sleep, and when she set the plate in front of him, it was a better breakfast than he'd made for himself in 15 years. "You cooked before," he said, "professionally." "I ran the kitchen at the halfway house station on the Laramie Road for 4 years," she said, sitting down across from him with her own plate. 40 miners a morning, 3 meals a day. You learn not to waste time." "Why'd you leave?" She picked up her fork, set it down again. "My father got sick. I came home to care for him." She said it without any particular expression, the way people say things that are simply true and don't need decoration. "I thought I'd go back when he recovered. He didn't recover." Wyatt said nothing. He ate. She ate. Outside, the first bird started up. "How much did he owe Crowe?" Wyatt asked. She was quiet for a moment. "More than I knew. More than I think he knew toward the end. Crowe has a way of making debts grow." She looked at her plate. "The interest rates he charges aren't legal. I know that now. But knowing it and being able to do anything about it are two different things, especially when the sheriff in Black Hollow has worked for Crowe for 12 years. There it was. Wyatt turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Your father, what was his work?" "He was an accountant," she said. "He kept books for several businesses in the valley. Crowe was one of them." She looked up. "Why?" "Just wondering what kind of man he was." She looked at him for a moment longer than the question required. "He was a good man who made a bad decision and spent the last 10 years paying for it. Most people are more complicated than what they end up being remembered for." She picked up her fork again. "Why do you ask about Crowe specifically?" "He's a big operation," Wyatt said. "Hard not to hear things." She nodded, but her eyes said she'd filed the question away. "Abigail Carter." He was already understanding, didn't let things go. She received information, and she held it, and she came back to it later when you'd stopped expecting her to. He respected that too. He also knew it was going to be a problem. After breakfast, she washed the dishes without asking whether she should. He went out to check the cattle. When he came back 2 hours later, she had swept the main room, found a loose hinge on the supply shelf, and fixed it with a nail she'd located in the tin beside the stove. He stood in the doorway and looked at the shelf. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The shelf was going to give," she said. "Your flour was on it. I would have fixed it. You were busy with the cattle." She dried her hands on a cloth and looked at him. "I'm not going to sit in a chair all day and wait to feel grateful, Mr. Boone. That's not who I am." "I didn't ask you to." "Good." She folded the cloth. "Then we understand each other." He almost smiled. He caught it before it got out. The days built on each other that way, each one starting before sunrise, each one carrying its own small negotiations. She cooked. He worked the cattle. She found things that needed doing and did them without announcing it. He noticed and said nothing because she clearly didn't want it said. There was a rhythm to it that settled over the cabin, like the summer heat, something that asked nothing dramatic from either of them, and for that reason felt more honest than most things Wyatt had experienced. But she was watching him. He knew it the way you know when a smart animal is tracking your movements, not obviously, not constantly, but with a patience that meant something. Every time he went to the back room, every time he was quiet for too long, every time his eyes went to the far ridge for a few seconds more than the view required, she was watching, and she was adding things up. On the fourth day, she asked about the horse. Scout had a scar along his left shoulder, a deep one long-heeled that ran at a diagonal across the muscle. Most people didn't notice it, or if they noticed, they didn't ask. She noticed it on the first day. She asked about it on the fourth. "What happened to him?" she said. They were outside Scout tied at the post, while Wyatt checked a loose shoe. "Old wound," he said. "From what? A fence wire. Years back." She was quiet for a moment. She reached out and ran her fingers lightly along the scar, and Scout turned his head and looked at her with one large dark eye and didn't pull away. Animals Wyatt had noticed were almost always right about people. "He trusts you a lot," she said. "For a horse that's been hurt." "He knows I won't hurt him again." "How does he know that?" Wyatt looked at her. "Because I haven't." She held his gaze. "That's not how trust works," she said quietly. "Not for things that have been scared. Being not hurt isn't the same as being safe. It takes more than that." He looked back at Scout's shoe. "I know," he said. She stepped back. The conversation was over. But it hadn't been about the horse, and they both understood that, and neither of them said so. That evening he made the mistake. He'd been careful. 15 years of being careful had made it as automatic as breathing. The ledger went under the floorboard every morning. The loose board settled back into place. Nobody would find it unless they knew to look. But that evening, he'd come in from the south pasture with his mind on the cattle count, and the dry grass, and the fact that if it didn't rain in the next 2 weeks, he was going to have a serious problem, and he'd set the ledger on the table while he poured himself a drink. And then he'd heard Scout act up outside and gone out to check. And when he came back in, Abigail was standing at the table. The ledger was open. She wasn't reading it frantically. She wasn't scrambling to put it back. She was standing very still with her hands flat on the table on either side of it, and she was reading the page that it had fallen open to, and her face had gone a color that wasn't quite white and wasn't quite gray. He crossed the room in 3 strides and closed the ledger. She didn't move. "That's not yours," he said. "No," she said. Her voice was strange, flat in a different way than he was used to from her, not controlled, but stunned. "No, it isn't." She looked up at him. "That's my father's name." The bottom dropped out of something in his chest. "Abigail." "Page 43, she said. "Edmund Carter. Debt transferred. Collateral documents held." She swallowed. "What documents?" "What collateral?" He said nothing. Her jaw set hard. Wyatt. What documents? He pulled out a chair and sat down. For a moment he just looked at the table. Then he said, "Sit down." "I don't want to sit down." "I know. Sit down anyway." She sat. She folded her hands in front of her, and she looked at him, and she waited, and the waiting was harder than any question would have been. "Your father came to me," he said. 2 years ago, before he got too sick to travel. He rode up here himself." He paused. "He had a book, a ledger of his own. He'd been keeping Crow's accounts for 9 years, and he'd been recording things in that ledger that Crow didn't know he was recording. Payments that didn't match the stated purposes, transfers to men who didn't exist, land purchases done under names that turned out to be shells, deaths recorded as accidents that your father believed weren't." Abigail hadn't moved. "He knew what he had," Wyatt continued. "He knew what it was worth, and he knew that if Crow found out he had it, he wouldn't live long enough to do anything with it." He turned the ledger slightly toward himself. "He asked me to hold it, to keep it somewhere safe, until he was well enough to take it to a federal marshal. He trusted me because I was the only man in the territory that Crow couldn't reach." The silence stretched out long. "And then he died," Abigail said. "Yes. And you still have the book." "Yes. And you didn't—" She stopped. Her voice had cracked just barely on the edge of the word. She pressed her lips together. "You didn't tell anyone." "Not yet. Not without knowing who to trust." "How long have you been—" She stopped again. "How long have you been doing this collecting information on Crow?" 6 years. She looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. Like the shape of something she'd thought she understood had just shifted into a different configuration, and she was recalibrating. He recognized the look. He'd worn it himself once. "That's what this is," she said slowly. "That's why you're up here alone. That's why you know the names. That's why you knew who Crow was the moment the auctioneer said debt certified." Her voice had gone very quiet. "You're building a case against him." "Trying to," Wyatt said. "For 6 years." "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had come up the way it did on summer evenings, at elevations sudden and cool, after the heat of the day. "How many names are in that ledger?" she asked. 47, he said. "That I can confirm. There are more I haven't been able to verify." 47 people. Men and women both. Some of them just lost land. Some of them lost more than that. She put her hand flat on the closed cover of the ledger, a gesture that wasn't quite possessive and wasn't quite protective. It was both. "My father tried to stop him," she said. "He wasn't a coward. He just didn't know how." "I know that," Wyatt said. She looked up sharply. "Do you—" "Your father was a brave man who was in an impossible position. He found the one way out he could think of, and he took it. That ledger he kept, that took years of careful work, that took courage." He held her gaze. "I told him that when he was here." Something shifted in her face, something that looked for just a moment like it might become grief if she let it. She didn't let it. She pulled her hand back from the ledger and set it in her lap, and she straightened her spine the way women do when they've decided that tears are going to have to wait. "What do you need?" she asked. He blinked. "To finish it," she said. "To build a case strong enough that a federal marshal can act. What do you still need?" He hadn't expected that. He'd expected fear. He'd expected her to ask him to take her somewhere safer, somewhere away from anything connected to Crow. He'd been prepared to tell her that was reasonable, that he'd arrange it. He hadn't expected that question. "There's a ledger your father kept separately," he said carefully. "The one he brought me has the financial records. But he told me there was a second book, a personal journal. He kept names, dates, conversations, witnesses to things. Testimony he recorded as he gathered it." He paused. "He didn't bring the journal. He said it was too dangerous to move yet. He said it was hidden in the house." Abigail went very still. "I know that house," she said. "I know you do. If Crow's people have been through it." They were looking for the financial ledger. They might not have found the journal if it was well hidden. He watched her face. "Your father knew how to hide things. He hid 6 years' worth of financial records under a man's nose for 9 years. She looked at the table. Her jaw was working. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the fear and the anger and the grief all running alongside the practical question of what was possible, what was worth the risk, what her father would have wanted. He hid things in the floor, she said finally. There's a section under the kitchen hearth. Loose stone, third one from the left. She looked up. He used to keep money there when I was small. He said it was for emergencies. This would qualify, Wyatt said quietly. She held his gaze for a long time. If I go back to Black Hollow, she said, Crow will know within the hour. Yes. And if he figures out what we're looking for, he'll move fast, Wyatt said, which means we'd have to move faster. We, she said. It was just one word, but the way she said it, not with hope, not with assumption, just with the quiet precision of someone who needed to know exactly what she was standing on, it landed solidly in the space between them. Yes, he said. We. She nodded once, slowly. Then she stood, picked up their empty cups, and carried them to the basin without another word. He watched her move through the kitchen with that same quiet efficiency, and he thought about what she'd said about Scout, that being not hurt wasn't the same as being safe, that it took more than that. He thought maybe she was starting to learn the difference. And then he thought about Randall Crow, who had 47 names in Wyatt's ledger, who had a sheriff in his pocket, and a deputy who looked the other way, who had somehow reached all the way up a mountain and walked a woman right into the middle of a fight she hadn't known she'd been born into. He thought about the second ledger hidden under a stone hearth in a dead man's house. He thought about how long he'd been waiting for the piece that would make the case complete. He hadn't wanted it to come this way. He hadn't wanted her to be the one who carried it, but wanting things to be different had never in Wyatt Boone's experience made them so. He was still sitting at the table when she came back from the basin and she stopped beside him. Not sitting, not leaving, just standing there in the lamplight with her arms crossed and something on her face that was going to be a question. That silver bracelet, she said. His whole body went very still. On your wrist, she said. Her voice had changed. It was careful now. Almost careful. I noticed it the first day. I didn't say anything because I didn't know how. She paused. Where did you get it? He could have said anything. He could have said he'd bought it. He could have said he didn't remember. He could have said it didn't concern her and watched her face close down and let the moment pass and kept one more thing for himself. Instead, he looked at the bracelet. It was given to me, he said, a long time ago. By a man I owed a debt to. What kind of man? The kind who should have lived longer than he did. She sat down across from him. Her eyes hadn't moved from his wrist. That bracelet, she said slowly, was my father's. I would know it anywhere. He wore it every day from the time I was 4 years old until the year he got sick. Her voice was absolutely steady. He told me he'd given it to someone for safekeeping. He told me that person would know what to do when the time came. She looked up. He meant you. The fire popped. Neither of them moved. He was a good man. Wyatt said, his voice rough at the edges in a way he hadn't intended. I want you to know I told him that. He worried you'd think he'd failed you. I told him that a man who spends 9 years collecting evidence against the most dangerous person in the territory at risk to his own life, so that someday there might be justice, that man hasn't failed anyone. Abigail's throat moved. He gave me the bracelet, Wyatt said, and he said when the time is right, this will tell someone what they need to know. I didn't understand it then. He looked at her. I think I understand it now. She pressed her lips together hard. 1 breath. 2. Then, he knew, she said. He knew I'd end up here. Maybe, Wyatt said. Or maybe he just knew that good things have a way of finding each other given enough time. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that has weight and shape, the kind that comes after something true has been said, and both people need a moment to let it settle. Abigail reached across the table. She didn't take his hand. She touched the bracelet. One finger light as a question against the worn silver. Then she pulled her hand back, stood up and said goodnight in a voice that was steadier than it had any right to be. Wyatt sat alone at the table for a long time after her door closed. Outside, the summer wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Somewhere on the mountain, an owl called once and fell silent. And in the lamplight, the silver bracelet caught the glow and held it. He'd carried it for 6 years. He was only beginning to understand what it had been carrying him toward. She had the plan worked out before he woke up. He knew because she was sitting at the table when he came out of his room and the coffee was already cold, which meant she'd been sitting there long enough that she'd stopped drinking it. The lamp was turned low. She had a piece of brown paper in front of her, the kind he used to wrap salt provisions, and she'd drawn something on it in charcoal. He sat down across from her without a word and turned the paper toward himself. It was a map, rough but accurate. The streets of Black Hollow, the position of the sheriff's office relative to the main road, the location of her father's house on the eastern edge of town, and 2 different approach routes drawn in from the north and south, with notes in small, tight handwriting along the margins. He looked at it for a long time. "You drew this from memory," he said. "I lived there for 26 years, she said. "I could draw it in my sleep." He looked at the 2 routes. "You've been thinking about how to get in without being seen." "I've been thinking about it since 2 in the morning, she said. "The south route is shorter, but it goes past the assay office, and Crow's foreman drinks at the saloon next door every night until closing. The north route is longer, but it comes in behind the livery stable. Nobody watches that end of town after dark." "You're thinking we go at night. I'm thinking there's no other option that doesn't get one of us shot," she said flatly. She picked up her cold coffee, looked at it, set it back down. "The stone I told you about, 3rd from the left under the kitchen hearth. If the journal is still there, I can find it in under 2 minutes. In and out before anyone knows we were in town." Wyatt studied the map. "Who else knows about that hiding spot? Nobody. My father never showed anyone but me. He showed me when I was 8. She paused. "He said every person ought to have one place where they keep the things that matter most." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Crow's men have been through the house, at least twice from what I heard before they put me on the wagon. They were looking for the financial ledger, the one my father brought you. They tore up the floor in the bedroom, went through every piece of furniture. But the hearth..." She shook her head. "You'd have to know to look. It looks like a normal hearthstone." "How far is the house from the edge of town?" 4 minutes on foot from the north approach, less if we move fast." He looked at the map again. Something in the route nagged at him. "The water trough behind the livery. Is it still there?" She blinked. "Yes. Why?" "Because the stable hand at that livery has worked for Crow for 3 years, Wyatt said. "He doesn't sleep in the stable, but he checks it twice a night. Last time I was in Black Hollow, he was on a schedule about 10 o'clock and again around 2. She looked at him. "You know his schedule." "I know a lot of schedules in Black Hollow," he said. "That's what 6 years of watching gets you." She was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. He watched her absorb this new dimension of him, not just a mountain man who'd stumbled into her situation, but someone who'd been mapping this fight for longer than she'd known it existed. He could see the adjustment happening in real time behind her eyes. "So we go between 10 and 2, she said. "Midnight," he said. "That gives us margin on both ends." She nodded. She reached across the table and turned the paper back toward herself and added a notation in the margin. He watched her hand move quick, certain no second guessing. She'd already been afraid and moved through it and come out the other side into the territory where fear becomes fuel. "We go tomorrow night," she said. It wasn't a question. "Tomorrow night," he agreed. What he didn't say, what he kept in the part of his chest where he stored the things he couldn't afford to feel too directly, was that he was afraid for her. Not in a way that assumed she couldn't handle it. In a way that knew exactly how fast Crow moved when he felt threatened, and exactly what happened to people who got caught between that man and something he wanted. He'd seen it. 47 times he'd seen it. He was not going to make it 48. They spent the rest of the day in a careful, concentrated quiet, the kind that settles over people who are preparing for something, and both understand that talking too much about it doesn't help. She reinforced the map's accuracy by walking him through the layout of the house in verbal detail. Every room, every door, every window that stuck, and every one that opened silently. He told her what he knew about Crow's current movements, that the man himself rarely came to Black Hollow in summer, preferring to operate from his main ranch 40 miles south, that he communicated through his foreman, a man named Dolan, who was clever enough to be dangerous and loyal enough to be worse. Dolan was there, Abigail said, her voice careful. When they took me. He was the one who read out the debt paperwork. He was very polite about it. She paused. The polite ones are always the worst. Yes, Wyatt said. They are. He'll know I'm not in the mine anymore, she said. He'll know someone pulled me out of that auction. He already knows. Crow will already know. That's not the question. What's the question? The question is whether they know where you are. He set down the rope he'd been mending. As far as anyone in Black Hollow saw you rode out with a stranger. There's no reason to connect that stranger to the mountain north of town. Not yet. But it's only a matter of time. Everything is only a matter of time, he said. That's why we move tomorrow. She accepted that with a nod and went back to what she was doing. But he noticed she moved to the window, not to look out, just to be near it. And he noticed she stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, and he understood she was doing the same thing he did sometimes. Measuring the distance between where she was standing and whatever was coming. He didn't say anything about it. Some things don't need to be named. That night, he took the financial ledger out from under the floorboard and went through it again, page by page, looking for anything connected to Edmund Carter that he might have missed. He found 3 entries he hadn't fully parsed before payments from a shell account to something listed only as the Consolidated Land Office, dated 14 months before Edmund Carter came to him. The amounts were large enough to be significant and vague enough to be intentional. He was still staring at those entries when Abigail's door opened and she came out in the dark, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. You should sleep, she said. I'm working. She came and looked over his shoulder at the page. He didn't move to cover it or angle it away. That time was past. What are those? She said, pointing to the shell account entries. Money moving somewhere it shouldn't. I'm trying to figure out where. She reached past him and turned the ledger slightly toward the lamp. He smelled wood smoke and something faintly like the sage she'd hung in her room. She studied the page in silence for a moment. Consolidated Land Office, she said slowly. That's not a real office. That's a phrase my father used in his journal shorthand. I remember he had a whole system for things he didn't want named directly. She straightened. He used that phrase specifically for land transactions that were done under false deeds. Land that was taken, not bought. Wyatt turned in his chair and looked at her. You've read the journal. Parts of it. The parts he left out for me before he got too sick to write. She tightened the shawl. He started leaving pages in places he knew I'd find them. Under my pillow. Inside my Bible. He knew he was running out of time. He was trying to tell me things without telling me things in case the wrong person found the notes first. What did the pages say? She sat down across from him. Her face in the lamplight was steady, but he could see the weight of it. The weight of carrying something this large for this long and not having anyone to put it down with. He said that Crow had been systematically taking land from small ranchers and farmers for 15 years. She said, not just with debt, with false deed transfers, with forged signatures, with deaths that looked like accidents but weren't. She paused. He said the journal had the names of the people who signed off on those deeds. Local officials, a land commissioner in the territorial capital, people who could be arrested. A land commissioner, Wyatt said. He went very still. You know who it is. I have a suspicion. I've had it for 2 years. If the journal confirms it. He stopped. The weight of it settled into him like stone into water. If the journal confirms it, this goes higher than a local corruption case. This reaches the territorial government. That changes what a federal marshal can do with it. She leaned forward. Then we have to get that journal. Yes, he said. We do. She looked at the ledger, then at him. My father knew this would be dangerous. He knew you were dangerous, not in the way Crow is dangerous, but in the way that a man who has decided to fight back is always dangerous to the people who want to stay comfortable. She paused. He trusted you with the most important thing he had. He sent me to you when he couldn't protect me himself. Wyatt didn't know what to say to that. He used to say, she continued, that the only thing stronger than a man who's given up on people is a man who hasn't. She met his eyes. He was talking about you. I know that now. The lamp flickered between them. Get some sleep. Wyatt said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. We've got a long ride tomorrow. She stood. She pulled the shawl tighter. She started toward her door, and then she stopped. Wyatt, she said. And it was the first time she'd used his name, without the formality of Mr., and they both noticed it, and neither of them mentioned it. Thank you for telling me the truth, about my father, about what he did. It was his truth to tell, Wyatt said. I was just holding it. She nodded once, and went to bed. He sat alone with the ledger and the lamp until the fire burned low. They rode out the next evening at dusk and came down off the mountain in the long purple light of a summer evening, taking the north trail, moving quiet. Abigail rode scout. Wyatt walked alongside on the trail he knew better than any road he'd ever traveled. They said almost nothing for the first 2 hours, and it wasn't uncomfortable silence anymore. It was the silence of two people who had arrived at a functional understanding of each other and didn't need to perform conversation to prove it. They tied the horses a half-mile north of town in a stand of cottonwoods by the creek and went in on foot. Wyatt had been in Black Hollow after dark before. He knew the sound of it. The saloon noise that carried 3 streets in any direction, the way the lamplit windows gave you enough to navigate by without being seen yourself. The particular quality of stillness in the residential streets on the east side where families went to bed early because they had to be up before the sun. Abigail moved beside him like she'd done this before. He suspected she hadn't, but she had good instincts and she trusted them, and that was worth more than experience in a situation like this. They came around the back of the livery at 9 minutes past midnight. Nobody there. The stable hand had made his 10 o'clock round and gone back inside. Abigail touched Wyatt's arm once light brief and pointed. He looked and nodded. They moved along the fence line to the edge of the residential street, crossed it in the gap between 2 lamp pools, and came up the alley behind her father's house. The back door had been left open. Not carelessly, the wood had warped in its frame, swelled with summer heat, and it didn't latch anymore. He'd noticed that in her description. He pushed it inward carefully, and they were inside. The house had been gone through hard. He'd expected that, but standing in the middle of it, the overturned furniture, the torn floorboards in the back room, the broken crockery that nobody had bothered to clean up, something in him went cold and deliberate. He looked at Abigail. Her face was a wall. She was looking at what had been done to her father's house, and she was feeling everything and showing nothing because she'd learned a long time ago that showing everything costs too much when you can't afford the price. She went to the kitchen. He followed. She crouched in front of the hearth, and her hands went immediately to the 3rd stone from the left, and even knowing what to expect, he was struck by how certain her movements were. She didn't test it or hesitate. She just pressed her fingers into the gap at the edge and pulled, and the stone came up with a low scraping sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent house. She reached in. Her hand found something. She pulled it out. A thin book wrapped in oilcloth tied with a leather cord. Small enough to fit in a coat pocket. Heavy with what it contained. She looked at it for just a moment, held it in both hands, not opening it, just holding it the way you hold something that belongs to a person you've lost, and then she tucked it inside her shawl and pressed the stone back into place and stood up. "Let's go," Wyatt said quietly. They turned for the door, and the back door of the house opened. Wyatt had his hand on his pistol before the light resolved into a figure not Dolan, not Crow's men, but a boy. 12, maybe 13, wide-eyed, holding a lantern in both hands, with the rigid terror of someone who had expected an empty house, and gotten considerably more than that. Wyatt recognized him after a second. The livery boy. Not the stable hand, the younger one, the one who brought water in the mornings. "Don't," Wyatt said quietly. Not a threat. A warning. The boy looked at Abigail. Something shifted in his face, recognition, and then something else. "Miss Carter," he whispered. Abigail stepped forward. "Tommy," she said very quietly. "It's all right. We're leaving." The boy's eyes moved between them. His lantern hand was shaking. "They said you'd gone into the mine," he whispered. "Mr. Dolan told everyone you went willing." "I didn't go willing," she said. "You know that." He swallowed hard, nodded. "I saw them put you on the wagon," he said. I didn't know what to do." "You were 12 years old," she said. "There was nothing to do." His face crumpled for just a moment. Then he squared it back up with the particular dignity of a child trying very hard to be older than he is. "Are you coming back?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "But we're going to fix it. Do you understand? We're going to fix it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, with a conviction that was almost heartbreaking. "I won't tell nobody I saw you," he said. "Thank you, Tommy," she said. They went out the front. The boy blocked the back and retracing past him felt wrong, and moved fast along the edge of the street. Wyatt kept himself between Abigail and the direction of the saloon noise, which was closer now louder, and he was calculating angles and timing, and the distance back to the cottonwoods when he heard voices ahead. He pulled her back into a doorway, without thinking his arm across in front of her, and she went without argument. She felt the shift in his body before she heard the voices herself, and she was already moving. 2 men. Coming up the street from the direction of the sheriff's office. Unhurried. One of them was talking about something mundane, horses or feed prices, and the other one was half listening. And Wyatt held his breath, and held very still, and felt Abigail's shoulder pressed against his arm, and felt her not moving, not making a sound. Every muscle in her controlled and deliberate. The men passed. They waited 10 more seconds. Then they moved. They were back to the cottonwoods in 11 minutes, and they untied the horses and rode north without speaking until the lights of Black Hollow had fallen completely behind them, and the mountain dark had swallowed the trail on both sides. Then Abigail said, "We got it." "Yes," he said. She laughed. It came out short and surprised, like she hadn't been expecting it herself. A real laugh unguarded the first one he'd heard from her, and it caught him completely off guard, and he found the corner of his mouth pulling up before he could stop it. "Don't get comfortable," he said, but without heat. "I'm not comfortable," she said. "I'm terrified. But we got it." "Yes," he said again. They rode in silence for a while. The stars were out. Scout moved steady and sure on the trail he knew, and the horse Abigail had borrowed from the brush corral behind his cabin did the same. After a time she said, "Tommy Briggs, that boy. He watched them take me and he didn't forget. He's been checking that house, I think. Making sure nobody else went through it." "Probably," Wyatt said. 12 years old, she said. And the way she said it, the softness in it, the grief for a child who'd carried something too heavy told him more about who she was than anything that had come before. They were an hour up the mountain when she said the thing he'd been waiting for, the thing he'd known was coming since the moment they'd left the house. "Open it with me," she said. "The journal, when we get back." He looked at her. "He was your partner in this," she said. "Whatever's in there, you have the right to know it at the same time I do." He thought about saying that it was her father's private words. He thought about the distance he'd kept deliberately between himself and other people's pain, because that distance had served him well for a very long time, and he knew how to live inside it. He thought about a small man on a tired horse, riding up a mountain alone to ask a stranger to hold the most important thing he owned. "All right," Wyatt said. They sat at the table with the lamp turned up, and the oilcloth unwrapped, and the leather cord untied, and the journal opened between them. Edmund Carter's handwriting was small and careful. The handwriting of a man who had been precise about everything, because precision was the only form of control he had left. The first pages were dates and figures, shorthand notations dense with meaning. And then deeper into the book, the handwriting changed. Got larger, less precise. The writing of a man who was sick and knew it, and was trying to get everything down before the time ran out. Wyatt read. Abigail read. And with each page, the shape of what Randall Crowe had built over 15 years became clearer and uglier and larger than even Wyatt's 6-year investigation had uncovered. The land commissioner's name was there. spelled out with dates and amounts and the location of a bank account in Denver. The names of 3 men who had died in accidents were there with the names of the men who'd been paid to arrange those accidents, and on the last written page in handwriting so shaky it was almost illegible. Edmund Carter had written something that had nothing to do with Crow at all. Abigail's hand covered her mouth. She read it twice. Then she looked at Wyatt, and her eyes were bright with something that wasn't quite crying, but was as close as she'd come since she'd arrived on his mountain. "What does it say?" he asked, though he could read it himself. He asked because he thought she needed to say it out loud. She swallowed. "It says, 'Abigail, if you find this, it means everything worked out the way it was supposed to. Trust the man who wears the bracelet. He's the only one who was never for sale.'" She stopped. "And then, it says I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you. Don't you dare spend 1 minute thinking otherwise." The lamp burned between them. Outside, the summer wind moved through the pines. Wyatt looked at the page, then at the woman across from him, who was holding herself together by sheer will, and he thought about how far a man's love could travel through sickness, through death, through a ledger kept in secret for 9 years, through a bracelet passed to a stranger through a stone in a hearth floor, to find its way back to the person it was meant for. "He knew," Abigail said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," Wyatt said. "He knew all of it. He planned all of it." "He did the best he could with what he had," Wyatt said. "That's what good fathers do." She pressed her hand flat over the last page. Held it there. And then she straightened, and she looked at Wyatt, and the grief was still there behind her eyes. But something else had come forward to stand in front of it. Something that looked in the lamplight very much like resolve. "What do we do next?" she asked. He looked at the journal. At everything it contained. At the name of a land commissioner in Denver, and the names of 3 dead men, and the shape of something large enough and damning enough to bring down not just Randall Crow, but the entire structure he'd built himself into. "We send word to a federal marshal," he said. "There's one in Cheyenne. I've been building toward him for 3 years. With what's in this journal and what's in my ledger, he'll have no choice but to act. How long will that take?" "A week to get word to him. Another week for him to move. Maybe less if he understands what he's looking at." She nodded. "And Crow?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Crow is going to find out we have the journal before that marshal ever arrives. He always finds out. The only question is how much time we have." She looked at him steadily. "Then we'd better not waste any of it." He held her gaze, and in the silence of the cabin on the mountain, with a dead man's words spread open between them, and a criminal's entire empire laid out in careful handwriting on 47 pages of evidence, Wyatt Boone made himself a promise he hadn't made in 15 years. He was going to finish this. And he was going to make sure she was still standing when it was done. The letter went out the next morning. Wyatt wrote it himself, 3 pages. In his careful hand laying out the case, the way a man builds a wall, one solid piece at a time, no gaps, nothing that could be argued away. He cited the financial ledger by page and entry. He cited the journal by date and witness. He named the land commissioner in Denver. He named the 3 dead men and the men who'd been paid to kill them. He named Randall Crow 14 times with specificity that could not be mistaken for accusation without evidence because it wasn't accusation without evidence. It was a record. He addressed it to Marshal David Reese Cheyenne and gave it to the only man in the territory he trusted to carry it, an old trail hand named Cooley, who lived 2 valleys over and had been delivering private correspondence for 20 years without once losing a letter or telling a soul what he'd carried. Cooley looked at the envelope, then at Wyatt, then at Abigail, who was standing in the cabin doorway. "This the kind of letter that brings trouble back to the man who sent it?" Cooley asked. "Trouble's already here," Wyatt said. "I'm just trying to make sure it has somewhere to go." Cooley tucked the letter inside his coat. 2 weeks, he said. "Fast as you can," Wyatt said. Cooley rode out without another word. Abigail watched him go. 2 weeks is a long time, she said. "I know. Crow will know by then." "Probably sooner," Wyatt said. She turned and looked at him. "How much sooner?" He'd been thinking about that since before the letter was sealed. He'd been running the timeline the way he ran everything forward from what he knew, accounting for what he didn't, building a picture of how a man like Randall Crowe responded when he felt something closing in on him. "Dolan is thorough," Wyatt said. "He'll have gotten a description of me from someone in that crowd. He'll start connecting the auction to the mountain. It might take him 5 days, might take him 3. He paused. "It won't take him more than a week. Then we have less time than the marshal needs to arrive." "Yes." She looked at the trail where Cooley had disappeared. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I know. Don't tell me I should." "I wasn't going to." She looked at him then, and there was something in her face that had moved past the careful wariness of the first days into something more direct, the expression of a woman who had decided that time was too short for pretending. "What's the plan?" He'd been building it since the night they'd opened the journal. "We make copies," he said, "of the critical pages from both ledgers. We hide one set here, one set somewhere Crowe's men would never find." "Where?" "Tommy Briggs," he said. She blinked. "The boy. He's been watching that house for 2 months without anyone noticing. That means he knows how to be invisible in Black Hollow. If I give him a sealed packet and tell him what it is and who to give it to if anything happens to us. He's 12 years old, Wyatt." "I know how old he is," Wyatt said. "I also know he didn't forget you. That's not a small thing." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right. But I'm the one who talks to him. I expected that," he said. They spent the next 2 days doing exactly that, copying entries cross-referencing dates, building a second complete evidence packet that could survive without the originals. Abigail worked alongside him at the table, her handwriting smaller and faster than his, her eye for the relevant detail sharp enough that twice she caught connections he'd missed after 6 years of looking. "There," she said on the second afternoon, pressing her finger to a page in her father's journal. "This name, Harker. He appears in my father's notes as a witness to the false deed transfer for the Milligan Ranch. But he also appears in your ledger page 61 as a recipient of a payment from the Shell account. Same man." Wyatt leaned over. She was right. He'd had Harker in his ledger as a potential bribe recipient, but hadn't connected him to the land deed records because the connection ran through the journal, which he hadn't had until 4 days ago. "That ties Crowe directly to the forgery," Wyatt said. "Not just the debt schemes, the actual land theft." "Which is a federal crime," she said. "Which is a federal crime," he confirmed. She sat back. "My father found this. He found all of this, and he did it alone, and he was sick and nobody knew." Her voice was controlled, but the edges of it were fraying. "I want people to know that. When this is over, I want people to know what he did." "They will," Wyatt said. "His name is on every page of that journal. Nobody who reads it will be able to miss what he built." She nodded once and went back to writing. He watched her for just a moment longer than he needed to, and then he went back to his own work, and neither of them said anything more about it. On the third morning they rode down to the valley approach, not to Black Hollow, but to the Dry Creek Junction 2 miles short of it, where Tommy Briggs came to water the livery horses every morning at 7. Wyatt held the horses in the trees. Abigail went alone. He watched from a distance. Saw the boy's face when he recognized her. The shock, the relief, the way his whole body shifted from the careful blankness of a child who'd learned to make himself unnoticed into something open and young, and still capable of surprise. He watched her talk to him low and close, watched her hand him the sealed packet, watched him tuck it inside his shirt with the serious expression of someone who understood exactly what they were being trusted with. When she came back, her jaw was tight. "He said yes," she said. "I could see that," Wyatt said. "He asked if we were going to be all right." She paused. "I told him yes." "Was that the truth?" She mounted up. "I intend it to be," she said. They were back on the mountain before noon. The day was hot, even at elevation, the air still and heavy, in a way that had weight to it, that pressed down on the shoulders and made the distances feel longer. Wyatt checked the cattle. Abigail reorganized the provisions, moving things into a configuration that would allow them to leave fast if they had to access what they needed without waste of time. He noticed what she was doing and didn't comment on it, because she was right to do it, and commenting on it would only acknowledge aloud what both of them were already thinking. The attack came on the fifth night. Not the way he'd been expecting, not with a direct approach up the trail, not with men on horses making enough noise to give 10 minutes of warning. It came with fire. He smelled it first. That particular smell of burning that carries something specific about the direction and the source and the intent behind it that speaks directly to some animal instinct older than thought. He was on his feet and at the window before Abigail's door opened. "Wyatt, I smell it," he said. The south pasture fence line was burning. Someone had set it deliberately in two places to drive the cattle north and fill the air with smoke and light, and to pull attention toward the pasture and away from the trail. "It's a distraction," he said. He heard Scout then, not the ordinary sounds of a horse at night, but the specific hard cry of an animal that has detected human presence where there shouldn't be any. Not from the pasture, from the trail. They're already on the mountain. "Get the ledgers," he said. His voice came out hard and even, and without panic the way it always did when the thing he'd been preparing for finally arrived. "Both of them. The journal. Put them inside the saddlebag I showed you, the one with the false bottom. If I tell you to ride, you ride north and you don't stop. I'm not leaving you. Abigail." He looked at her, 1 second direct. "The evidence is everything. If they get the ledgers, my 6 years and your father's 9 years mean nothing. The evidence leaves. No matter what happens to me." She held his gaze. Her jaw was set so hard he could see the line of it in the dark. Then she turned and went for the ledgers. He went out the front door. There were 3 of them on the trail. He heard them before he saw them. The particular sounds of men trying to be quiet, who weren't quite quiet enough, the creak of leather and the displaced stone underfoot. He put himself against the front wall of the cabin, just out of the lamp spill from the window, and he waited with everything he had. The first man came around the cabin corner, and Wyatt took him down, before he made a sound, not with the gun, with his body clean and efficient, and producing no noise that would bring the others faster than he was ready for them. He used the man's own momentum, the way a former cattle drive foreman learns to do with animals far larger than himself, and the man went down and stayed down. The second one heard something anyway. "Vance," he called out. Low tense. Wyatt stayed still. "Vance?" Louder now. And then the second man's voice changed, acquiring the particular tone of someone who has realized that the silence coming back at him isn't empty. He came around the corner fast and with his gun already drawn, and he was good better than the first one, and the shot he fired was close enough that Wyatt felt the air of it. Wyatt fired back. The second man went down, holding his shoulder, his gun in the dirt, and he was alive. But he was done, and Wyatt was already turning, because he'd counted 3, and there was one more somewhere, and the absence of sound from that direction was worse than noise. The third one was at the back of the cabin. At the back door. He heard Abigail's voice, not screaming, not frightened, something harder than that, and then a crash, and then her voice again saying something sharp and furious, and he covered the distance between the front and back of the cabin in 4 strides, and came through the back door to find Abigail standing with the cast-iron pan in both hands, and the third man on his knees on the floor, with his hands over his head, and an expression of profound reconsidering on his face. The saddlebag with the false bottom was on the table, buckled closed. She looked at Wyatt. Her breathing was fast, but her hands were steady. "He came through the window," she said. "I heard him." He looked at the man on the floor, then at her. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." He's been better," she said. He almost smiled. He secured the third man and went back to check the other 2. The one with the shoulder wound was conscious and furious, and telling Wyatt at some length what Randall Crowe was going to do to him, and Wyatt listened to all of this without expression, and then crouched down to the man's level. "You tell me something useful," he said quietly, "and I make sure your shoulder gets looked at before dawn. You keep talking about Crowe, and you sit here until you figure it out yourself." The man looked at him. He was young. Younger than Wyatt had registered in the dark. Late 20s, maybe. Working for Crow because Crow paid, and because nobody in this territory said no to Randall Crow if they wanted to keep working. "Dolan knows where you are," the man said. "He's known for 2 days. He didn't send us to kill you. He sent us to get the books." "I know that," Wyatt said. The young man blinked. "Then why?" "Because Crow knows that if I'm dead before the books are recovered, someone else might have them. He needs to find the books first." Wyatt held the man's eyes. "How many more is Dolan sending?" The young man was quiet. "Son," Wyatt said, and the word came out with a patience that surprised even him. "How many more?" "6, the young man said. "He's bringing them himself, tomorrow morning." Wyatt stood. 6 men, Dolan himself. Tomorrow morning. He went back inside. Abigail had the third man tied and seated against the wall. She'd done it with the efficiency of someone who'd had approximately 30 seconds to figure out how, and had figured it out. She looked up when Wyatt came in. She read his face. "How bad?" she asked. "Dolan, tomorrow, 6 men." She was quiet for 2 seconds. "Then we can't be here tomorrow." "No," he said. "We can't. The marshal won't arrive for another 9 days." "No." She looked at the saddlebag on the table. "We can't hide, not anymore. They know the mountain." She looked at him. "We have to go down." He looked at her. "Abigail." "Not to run," she said. "To fight." She straightened. "The journal, the ledgers, if we ride into Black Hollow and stand in the street and open them in front of witnesses, in front of everyone in that town who has lost something to Randall Crow, Dolan can't make us disappear. Not in public. Not with witnesses." She held his gaze, and her voice didn't waver. "My father built that case so it could be used, so it could be seen, not hidden under a floorboard forever." He looked at her for a long moment. She was right. She was completely right, and the part of him that had spent 15 years on a mountain, avoiding exactly this standing in the center of a town in public with no control over what happened next. That part of him recognized it and accepted it with a clarity that felt less like courage and more like something longer than courage. Something settled. "There's a man in Black Hollow," he said. "Retired judge. Name's Aldous Pruitt. He was removed from the bench 6 years ago after he tried to file a complaint against Crow's land practices and was told to withdraw it or lose his position. He withdrew it." He paused. "But I don't think he forgot." Abigail's eyes sharpened. "You think he'd stand with us?" "I think he's been waiting for someone to give him a reason to," Wyatt said. She was already moving. "I'll get the horses ready. We go at first light," he said. "The fire in the south pasture will burn itself out. The cattle will come back when the smoke clears." She stopped, turned. Something crossed her face, something quick and genuine that she didn't have time to put away before he saw it. "The cattle," she said. "You love that land." "Yes," he said. "And you're choosing to leave it." He held her gaze. "I'm choosing what matters more," he said. She looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than either of them was prepared for. Then she nodded, and the look on her face was something he didn't have a word for yet, but thought he might want one. She went to get the horses. He stood alone in this cabin one more time. He looked at the table where they'd worked side by side for 3 days. The shelf with the fixed hinge. The stove that had held a better breakfast than he'd made in 15 years. The lamp that had burned between them when she'd read her father's last words out loud. He picked up the saddlebag with the false bottom. He put on his coat. He went out the door. They rode down the mountain in the hour before dawn, 2 horses moving through pine. Dark and thin morning air. The world below them not yet awake to what was coming for it. Abigail rode without speaking, and so did he. And the silence between them now was the particular silence of 2 people who have passed through fire together and come out the other side knowing something about each other that doesn't need to be said. At the bottom of the mountain, where the trail met the valley road, she pulled even with him. "When this is over," she said, not looking at him, looking at the road ahead. "What do you want?" He thought about the question seriously. He always had when she asked him things. He owed her that. "For it to have mattered," he said. "For your father's name to be cleared. for the people on those pages to have something to point to. She nodded. And after that, he glanced at her. She was watching the road. Her profile in the early light was calm, and set in the way that things are calm when they've moved past fear into something more permanent. "I haven't thought that far," he said. It was honest. "Start thinking," she said quietly. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then Black Hollow appeared below them in the morning light, small and ordinary-looking, the way dangerous things so often do. And Wyatt Boone rode toward it with a woman beside him and a dead man's evidence under his arm, and 15 years of quiet anger finally irrevocably running out of places to be quiet. The town didn't know what was coming. It was about to find out. Black Hollow woke up slow that morning. The way small towns do in summer, the bakery first, then the livery, then the gradual creak of shutters opening one by one along the main street, as people moved from sleep into another ordinary day, without knowing it wasn't going to be ordinary at all. Wyatt and Abigail came in from the North Road at 6:45, which was earlier than the saloon crowd, and later than the men who'd already gone to the mines, which meant the street held exactly the kind of people they needed. Shopkeepers, families, the woman who ran the laundry, the old men who sat in front of the feed store and had nowhere particular to be. Witnesses. People with nothing to gain from Randall Crowe and everything to gain from watching him fall. Wyatt went straight to Aldous Pruitt's house. He didn't knock gently. He knocked the way you knock when time is a thing you're running out of, and the door opened in under 15 seconds, which told him the old judge had been awake for a while and wasn't surprised to have company at this hour. Aldous Pruitt was 71 years old. Thin as a fence rail, with white hair, and the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years watching people lie to him from witness stands and had developed a very specific intolerance for it. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Abigail. He looked at the saddlebag. "I heard there was trouble up at your place last night," he said. "Word travels fast," Wyatt said. "Word always travels fast when Dolan's men are involved. Come in." They came in. Wyatt set the saddlebag on the judge's table and opened it and laid the ledgers out, and Pruitt sat down and put on his reading glasses and started at the first page and didn't look up for 20 minutes. Abigail stood near the window. Wyatt stood near the door. Neither of them spoke, because the old man was reading, and the old man's face was doing things that didn't require narration, tightening, then stilling, then acquiring the particular expression of someone who is seeing, confirmed what they suspected, and finding that confirmation is both satisfying and sickening at the same time. When Pruitt finished, he took off his glasses and set them on the table. "The land commissioner," he said. "Gerald Marsh." "You know him," Wyatt said. "I reported him," Pruitt said, 6 years ago, to the territorial governor's office. I was told my complaint was without merit and advised to let the matter rest. His voice was very flat. "I have been letting it rest for 6 years. I find I am no longer interested in doing that." Abigail turned from the window. "Will you stand with us?" The old man looked at her. "Miss Carter," he said, "your father came to me once, 3 years ago. He sat in that chair where you're standing, and he told me he was keeping records and that someday those records would matter. I told him to be careful." He paused. "I should have done more than that. I have regretted it since the day I heard he'd died." He stood up steadier than a man his age had any right to be. "Yes, I will stand with you." Wyatt let out a breath he hadn't fully realized he was holding. "Dolan is coming with 6 men," he said, "probably within the hour." "Then we have approximately 1 hour," Pruitt said, already moving toward his coat, "to make sure that when he arrives, there are enough people standing in this street who know exactly what is in those ledgers, that making us disappear becomes considerably more complicated than he'd like." He looked at Wyatt. "I know every family in this town that Crowe has wronged, and I know which ones have been waiting for exactly this moment." He put on his hat. "Come," he said. "Let's go talk to some people." What followed was the fastest hour of Wyatt Boone's life, and he had lived through some hours that moved very fast indeed. Pruitt moved through Black Hollow like a man on fire, not frantic, not loud, but with the absolute purposeful velocity of someone who had been waiting for this errand for 6 years and was not going to waste a second of it. He knocked on doors. He said names. He told people specific things, not everything, just the pieces that applied directly to them. And he let the recognition do the work which it did, because the people of Black Hollow were not stupid, and they had not forgotten what had happened to them. They had simply believed that nothing could be done. The widow Hanson, whose husband's ranch had been taken under a fraudulent deed transfer 4 years ago, came out with her 2 grown sons. The Delgado family, who'd lost 3 acres of riverland to a debt manufactured by Crow's shell accounts, came out with every adult member of the household. The man who ran the hardware store, who'd been paying protection fees to Dolan's operation for 2 years, under threat of having his business license revoked by the county clerk, who was the ledger confirmed on Crow's payroll, came out with his brother. And Tommy Briggs came running from the livery before anyone called him, because Tommy Briggs had been waiting with the sealed packet inside his shirt for 4 days, and had spent every one of those days watching the North Road. He stopped in front of Abigail breathless and held out the packet. "You came back," he said. "I told you I would," she said. He nodded. He squared his shoulders. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay close to Judge Pruitt," she said. "Don't let that packet out of your hands unless I tell you personally that it's safe to." The boy's chin went up. "Yes, ma'am." By the time Dolan rode into Black Hollow at 8 in the morning, with 6 armed men at his back, there were 34 people standing in the main street, not with weapons, with presence, with the specific, gathered, deliberate presence of people who have decided that they are done being afraid and are willing to stand in one place and prove it. Dolan reined in. He was a lean man, carefully dressed with the controlled expression of someone who had learned long ago that the most useful thing a dangerous man can do is look harmless. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Abigail. He looked at Pruitt. Something moved behind his eyes. A calculation. The very fast, very cold calculation of a man who has ridden into a situation expecting one thing and found another. "Boone," he said. His voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. "You're a hard man to reach." "I haven't been hiding," Wyatt said. "No." Dolan's eyes moved to the ledgers that Pruitt was holding. "I see that." He looked back at Wyatt. "You understand that those documents belong to Mr. Crow." "They belong to Edmund Carter," Abigail said, "who is dead, which makes them mine." Dolan looked at her for the first time directly. There was something in that look, a reassessment quick and precise, that told Wyatt the man had expected her to be frightened and was adjusting to the information that she wasn't. "Miss Carter," Dolan said, "you have been through a difficult time. Mr. Crow is prepared to be generous." "Mr. Crow," Pruitt said from where he stood with the ledgers, "is named 47 times in these documents in connection with fraud, extortion, false imprisonment, and 3 counts of murder for hire." His voice carried. It was a courtroom voice trained over 40 years to reach every corner of every room it entered. "These documents have been copied in full. Copies have been dispatched to Federal Marshal David Reese in Cheyenne. The originals will be held in my possession pending the marshal's arrival." The crowd was very quiet. Dolan hadn't moved. He was very good at not moving when he needed to think. But Wyatt was watching his hands, and his hands had shifted just barely, just a fraction, toward the gun at his hip. Wyatt stepped forward, 1 step, into the space between Dolan's horse and the crowd. "Don't," he said. 1 word. Quiet enough that only Dolan heard it. Dolan looked at him. "There are 34 people watching you right now." Wyatt said, still quiet, still even. "Half of them have been wronged by the man you work for. All of them know what's in those books. If you draw that gun, you will not make this better for Randall Crow. You will make it worse. Because then, it stops being a case built on paper, and it becomes something this town watched happen in their street." Dolan's hand stayed where it was. "And if you're thinking," Wyatt continued, "that you can ride back and tell Crow to run, you're welcome to try. But Marshal Reese has been waiting for a case like this for 3 years. The moment that letter arrived, this was finished. The only question now is what you want your own part in it to look like." A long silence. Then one of Dolan's 6 men, the youngest one on the left, quietly put his hands where everyone could see them. It wasn't surrender. It was a statement of preference. The man next to him did the same. Dolan looked at his men, at the crowd, at Pruitt with the ledgers. And then Dolan did something Wyatt hadn't fully predicted. He dismounted. He didn't reach for his gun. He stood on the ground in front of his horse, and he looked at Wyatt with an expression that had lost the pleasantness and found something older underneath it, something tired maybe, something that had been carrying a long time. "How long?" he said. Just that. Just the question. "6 years on my end," Wyatt said. 9 years on Edmund Carter's. Dolan absorbed that. He was a patient man. He was a brave man, Abigail said from behind Wyatt. Her voice was clear and steady and carried to every corner of the street. He spent 9 years inside Randall Crow's operation, recording everything he witnessed, because he believed that the truth was worth more than his own safety. He was right. Dolan looked at her for a long moment. Then he unbuckled his gun belt and held it out to one side and let it drop into the dirt. 3 of his men did the same. The other 3 looked at each other, calculated their odds against 34 witnesses, and a retired federal judge, and followed. The crowd didn't cheer. These were not people in the habit of cheering. They'd been beaten down too long for that kind of easy release. Instead, a sound moved through them that was quieter and more durable. A collective exhale, the sound of people who have been holding their breath for years and have just cautiously stopped. Tommy Briggs let out a whoop from somewhere near the back. He was 12. He'd earned it. What came next was not simple or fast, because justice never is. Prewitt took custody of Dolan and his men with the help of 3 townsmen who stepped forward without being asked. He sent a second rider to Cheyenne with a full written account of the morning's events addressed to Marshal Reese alongside Wyatt's original letter. He convened an informal but legally binding proceeding in the town meeting hall, the first time that hall had been used for anything resembling lawful authority since the current sheriff had taken office on Crow's recommendation, and he began taking testimony. The widow Hanson went first, then the Delgado family, then 7 more people before noon, each of them telling things they'd believed would never be heard by anyone who could act on them. Wyatt sat at the back of the hall and listened to all of it. He'd spent 6 years building a case in isolation, names in a ledger entries cross-referenced a picture assembled in private. He had understood it intellectually, the scope of what Crow had done. But sitting in that hall and hearing it spoken aloud by the people it had happened to in their own words with their own grief and anger, giving it a human weight that no ledger entry could carry, that was different. That settled into him differently. That meant something different. Abigail sat beside him. At some point during the widow Hanson's testimony, her hand had found his on the bench between them. He wasn't certain when. He was certain he hadn't moved his hand away. Randall Crow was arrested at his ranch 40 miles south at 3 in the afternoon by 2 federal deputies who had, it turned out, already been in the territory for a week, following leads that Wyatt's original correspondence sent months earlier, before Abigail had ever come into the picture, had set in motion. Marshal Reese, when he arrived 4 days later, told Wyatt that the case had been building on the federal end longer than Wyatt had known, and that Edmund Carter's financial ledger combined with the journal was the last piece of an investigation that now extended to the territorial capital and implicated Gerald Marsh, the land commissioner, along with 2 members of the county commission and a bank officer in Denver. "Your man, Carter," Reese said, looking at the journal, "was meticulous." "Yes," Wyatt said. "He was." "His daughter know the full scope of what he built." Wyatt looked across the room to where Abigail was seated with Prewitt going through the final documentation. "She's beginning to," he said. Reese followed his gaze. "She rode into that street this morning with you." "She did." "Brave woman." "The bravest I've met," Wyatt said, and he said it simply without decoration, because it was simply true. The land was returned. Not immediately. These things move through channels and require paperwork and the patience to let the law do what the law does when it is finally properly invoked. But the process began within the week. The Hanson Ranch. The Delgado land. 4 other properties taken under fraudulent deeds over 15 years each one, now with a legitimate claim being processed through a court that was no longer operating under Crow's influence because Crow was in federal custody awaiting trial, and his influence had evaporated the moment the ledgers were opened in a public street in front of 34 witnesses. The sheriff resigned. Quietly, on a Tuesday. Nobody in Black Hollow was particularly surprised. On the 7th day after it was over, Wyatt went back up the mountain. He told himself it was for the cattle. He checked the cattle. He fixed the section of fence that had burned in the south pasture. He did all of the things that needed doing, and in between doing them, he stood in his cabin and looked at the fixed hinge on the supply shelf and the table where they'd worked side by side for 3 days, and the 2 coffee cups that were still on the shelf beside the stove because he hadn't put them away. He didn't know what he was waiting for. He was lying to himself about that. He knew exactly what he was waiting for, and what he didn't know was whether it was reasonable to want it, whether he had the right to want it, whether a man who had spent 15 years making himself into someone who needed nothing was allowed to recognize at 53 that he'd been wrong about that. He was sitting on the porch at dusk when he heard a horse on the trail. He knew the sound of it before he saw it. He'd know Scout's walk on any surface in any light. He stood up. Abigail came around the bend on Scout, sitting straight-backed with a travel bag strapped behind the saddle. She rode up to the porch and stopped and looked at him with those flat, clear eyes that weren't flat or empty anymore, that hadn't been, he realized, for a long time. "You left," he said. "You left first," she said. "I had cattle to check." "You've had cattle to check for 15 years, she said. "That's not why you left." He didn't argue with that. She dismounted. She tied Scout's reins to the post, the way she'd done 100 times, with the quick, familiar movement of someone who belonged in a place, and she walked up the porch steps and stood in front of him, with her chin at that angle he'd first seen on a wagon in the middle of a street. The angle that looked like pride, until you got close enough to know it was something stronger than that. "I spent 3 days in Black Hollow after you came back up here," she said. "I helped Prewitt with the documentation. I gave testimony to the marshal. I sat with the Hanson family when they got word the ranch was being returned." She paused. "I did all of it. And when it was done, I realized that I could go anywhere. The debt is paid. The case is closed. I have a small amount of money from the estate that Crow can no longer touch. I could go to Laramie. I could go back to the halfway house station on the road." She held his gaze. "I could do a lot of things." "Yes," he said carefully. "You could." "I came here," she said. He looked at her. "I want to be clear about something," she said, and her voice was steady, and her eyes were direct, and she was not a woman who said things sideways when she could say them straight. "I'm not here because I have nowhere else to go. That was true 6 weeks ago. It is not true now." She reached into her coat pocket and held out her hand. In her palm were 4 $10 bills. $40. He looked at the money, then at her. "The debt," she said, "is paid." His chest did something complicated and large. "Abigail, I'm not finished," she said. "You paid $40 in a street in Black Hollow for a woman you didn't know. That was a transaction. I've been thinking for a week about whether what came after was also a transaction, and I've decided it wasn't." She closed her hand around the money, and then set it deliberately on the porch railing between them, not returning it to her pocket, not pressing it into his hand, just setting it down. "I think you know it wasn't." "I know it wasn't," he said. "Then I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly, not carefully. You've been careful for 15 years. I'm asking you to stop for 60 seconds. He waited. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked. The porch was quiet. Somewhere in the trees the first night birds had started. Scout shifted his weight at the post. The mountains settled around them with the low sounds it made at the end of a summer day, the sounds Wyatt had spent 15 years learning to hear as company when they were not. "Yes," he said. Just that. Just the truth the way she'd asked for it. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face that he still didn't have a word for, something warm and real and unguarded, in the way that things are unguarded when they've moved past the need to protect themselves because they've found a place where protection isn't the only option. "Good," she said. Then she picked up her travel bag, walked past him through the front door of the cabin, and set it down inside with the particular finality of someone who has decided where they're putting something down and intends it to stay. He stood on the porch alone for a moment. He looked at the $40 on the railing. He picked it up. He held it in his hand for a long moment. This money that had started everything that had stood in a crowd in Black Hollow, and changed direction of 2 lives without knowing it was doing so. And then he put it in his pocket. Not to keep, not to return, just because it belonged to the story, and the story wasn't finished being carried. He went inside. She was at the stove. She'd found the coffee tin without asking where it was. She turned when she heard him come in, and looked at him across the cabin with the evening light coming through the window, and she didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and it was the most complete quiet he had ever stood inside. "I should tell you," she said finally, "that I have opinions about how this kitchen ought to be organized." "I know you do," he said, "and I intend to act on them." "I expected nothing less," he said. She turned back to the stove. He sat down at the table. Outside, the summer wind came through the pines with the sound he'd learned to fall asleep, to the sound that had kept him company through 15 years of mornings and evenings, and all the long, quiet, waiting hours in between. It had been enough. He understood now that it had been enough for exactly as long as it needed to be, and that the waiting was over, and that some things take the time they take, and then arrive without apology. And the only thing asked of you is that you don't turn away when they do. Abigail Carter set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from him, and the lamplight fell between them the way it had on the first night she'd read her father's words. And Wyatt Boone looked at the woman who had walked into his life in borrowed boots and a torn dress, and had proceeded without asking permission to fix his shelf map. His enemy retrieve her father's evidence ride into a street full of armed men and dismantle the most powerful criminal operation in the territory. And he thought that his father, if he'd lived, would have had a great deal to say about the fact that it took this long. He would have been right. "Thank you," Abigail said quietly. "Not for any one thing, for all of it. The way you thank someone when the list is too long to name, and they already know what's on it." "Your father did the hard part," Wyatt said. "I just held what he gave me." She shook her head. "You held more than that." He thought about the bracelet on his wrist. About a small man on a tired horse riding up a mountain alone, because he'd run out of other options and had decided to trust a stranger. About the way trust works, not like a decision, but like a direction. Something you keep moving in until the distance behind you is long enough to call a road. He looked at her. "Stay as long as you want," he said. She met his eyes. "I intend to," she said. Outside, the last light left the sky, and the mountain went dark in the way it did on summer evenings, slowly, softly, without drama, the way things end when they've gone exactly as far as they were always meant to go. The silver bracelet caught the lamplight, and in the cabin on the mountain, for the first time in 15 years, Wyatt Boone was not alone. Not because someone had nowhere else to go, but because someone had looked at every place they could have gone and chosen without hesitation to be exactly here. That was not a transaction. That was a life.